Good afternoon. How are you doing? Welcome to another time here. Welcome to another time at the book club. Thanks for coming. Thanks for making it. Thanks. That's what we gotta do. 2 p.m. West African time. We gotta do this on Sundays. And we're presently reading through a book, The Confidence Game is our ninth book in the series. And we've been on this for a while, and we're presently still in chapter 4, talking about the rope. You know, pretty much convincing, persuading uh, the mark, to make a decision. That's what we've been discussing, and in that wise, we've talked about what negotiation looks like. Talked about persuasion, and to finish the chapter, we're presently talking about how to, move someone to make a decision. You know, People don't make decisions in isolation. The people can make the decision that we want them to make, or we can help them make the right decision. We can make them to be more proficient in making the right decision by setting the environment around, the issue they want to decide upon. The environment can be set up in such a way that it could help them or not help them, sway them in one way or the other. So the act of doing that is what we want to discuss. And to help us in that wise, we're presently reading this book. In addition to it, it's called The Decision Architecture by Rebecca Meijlink. We've also gone ahead to get this book called The Notch, by Richard Taylor and Cass Sunstein, and we're trying to pick whatever we can pick from that. And also Decisions About Decisions by Cass R. Sunstein. So open with these three books and maybe more, we can be able to talk about how to design an environment, to aid someone in making a decision. The those that do 419, the con man, con person also creates an environment to make us make a decision that would favor them, that would enwrap us or entrap us. They construct the environment in such a way that you know they decide the decision that we're going to make, right? And so this discussion is also talking that wise, so that when we see such an architecture or setup, we understand, the things that are working, against us and the things that are working for us and how to rightly address it. It also helps us, in the daily activities of life, in an ethical way to help the people that we're working with to make the right decision. So those are the things we're going to talk about as we talk about decision architecture or nudge architecture, nudging people, to help them make, quality decisions, So that's what we'll be talking about. Uh, Obviously, a lot of this is new to me also. So I didn't hold last week because I needed time to finish the books so I can get a good understanding of it also. So I don't come here and start biting my mouth. So hopefully I have some proficiency that we can discuss with. Uh, I'm going to bring up my slide here and we'll see what we can do. Alrighty. So we've been talking about the con game, and we say the con game, is divided into four parts, really, which is what the book is broken into. The put up where we try to find out about the person that we want to work with. From an unethical standpoint, a con game is the victim. From an ethical standpoint, is our audience, our target audience. For you to be able to communicate rightly or make the right presentation, you need to know the audience you're trying, to make the presentation to. That's what we learned when we spoke about communication in I believe that would be our third book, by T.D. Jakes, yeah, which is titled Don't Drop the Mic. We'll learn the fact that if you're going to go make a presentation to a group, you need to know the group, which is also what ties to Sun Tzu's Sun Tzu's The Art of Warfare. He says that if you want to win, if you don't know yourself and you don't know your audience, you're gonna lose every time. If you know your audience and you don't know yourself, you're gonna win some, lose some. If you know yourself, you don't know your audience, you'll win some, lose some. But if you want to guarantee winning most or all the time, you need to know yourself and you need to know your audience. So that's what this is about. You need to know the people that your target audience that you're talking to, and you also need to know yourself and to yourself, then be true also. So you then know your weakness, your strength, and you know how to then carry yourself, making a presentation to your audience. That's important. Uh, so the next thing after the you know your audience, from the unethical part, which is a con game, is then you begin to then engage, the victim, or the target of the game, and that's what we call the play. You introduce the victim to the game, and we spoke about that in chapter 3. And here in chapter 4, we're talking about how to convince, our how to convince our well, on the unethical part, it's how to convince the victim. On the ethical part, it's how to persuade, our target, how to persuade our target and get them to a place or 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 design the environment around them to help them, make a quality decision. For the con game, it will be to make a decision in line with the game that has been set up. From the ethical part, we're trying to help them make the right decision, a decision that is beneficial to them. Obviously, it's a mutual beneficial, mutually beneficial. It's a win-win. If I'm making a presentation, I'd like to get some benefit from making a presentation also, but in a way that is mutually beneficial. So that's what the rope is, and that's what we spent our time on. In chapter 4 here, we've looked at it from a place of negotiation, because part of it is negotiation. We looked at it from a place of persuasion, and the last part of it, we're looking at it in the way we construct the environment, so as to help, our target make, a mutually beneficial decision. Chapter 5 will talk about, finally selling, the product itself, which is talking about the tail, but that's coming in chapter 5. So as we close here in chapter 4, again, like what we've said, there are 4 parts to every engagement. Is the communicator, which could be in the unethical side will be the grifter, and every other thing is just the communicator, the presenter, and there's a message to be passed across. There's a how that the message is being passed across, and obviously there's the audience, which it could be the mark. So the core of what we're doing, we've been talking about, the how the message is being passed across. So we've talked about it, what it takes if it's a negotiation. We've talked about what it takes if it's a persuasion. And lastly, here we're trying to talk about how to set the environment, to make the environment to help the person, yeah, or the people make a mutually beneficial, decision. There's a decision to be made, and that decision could be optimized based on the environment that is set around which, the person is making the decision. You know, when we talked about persuasion, we talked about the 7 psychological principles of persuasions as put together by Robert Cialdini. Said one of them is reciprocity. If you want someone to do something, then you create or create an environment or pressure on the person by offering something first, that triggers, initiates the natural tendency of the person wanting to do something in return. We call it reciprocity. It's just a nature, human nature, to want to return favor for favor, you know, uh, good act for good act, so you can tap into that in a person when you do something, of value the person wants to return. Also, for me, I've observed, that one of the ways that con people, get you engaged is because they come in a cordial way. They approach you in a cordial way, and some are, even though I know the person is trying to con me, if the person approaches me with a sense of cordiality, I feel kind of like I hold the person to be cordial back. That cordiality with which they start is kind of difficult. My human tendency is to be cordial also, and that's part of reciprocity, So even though they want to con you, they come, in a cordial form, of some kind of respect or the other, and that kind of demands of you to be cordial also, but you just have to manage that, because you don't want to lose your good nature just because, someone is has an evil intent. So you're managing keeping your good intent at the same time not being swindled, and for me, that's part of what the Bible talks about, be as wise as a serpent, but as gentle as a dove. Your wisdom helps you to uh, see through the crack, see the tree for the forest, see through the game. But you don't want to, because of what you see, then lose your cool or become a different nature from who you truly are, so that's our place of, being wise. Your wisdom helps you to see. You also need your wisdom to help you to respond, not to react, to respond. You think about it, and relate or respond in such a way that you don't lose who you are. You don't lose your own good nature, because of someone's evil intent. You know, that's what we call we call the pause, right? The divine pause, or just a pause, is that time between stimuli and response, that time for you to uh, make a decision, to respond in such a way that you'll be proud of, not respond in such a way that you'll regret later on. Respond in such a way that when that video is played back, you'll be proud of yourself the way you did respond. So but it's a human nature in us that wants us to uh, return good for good, sometimes bad for bad. If someone, if it's not a good or cordial, you know, um, uh, cordial outlook or cordial offering that the person brings to you, but then also just the same way, if someone comes and it's coming rough, wisdom entails that we don't return evil for evil. You don't lose your good nature because of another person's bad nature, right? It's our place again for you to pause, the time between stimuli and response, and decide what is within my nature and wise to do, right? So, and the second one, what we said is commitment and consistency, kind of taps into the human nature or desire or craving to be consistent, so you try to get the person to commit, knowing that once the person commits, that human nature, that human nature in us wants to be consistent with what we have already committed to or what we have done before, what we're used to, So that's another thing. You can tap into people, and people tap in, to persuade others. You get them to commit to something that is easy for them to decide. You give them a bait, as it were, or give them to something that's easier to commit to. And once they commit to the little, it's easier to commit to the large. And people do that in different ways. People have a seminar, they do an introductory seminar that gives the people a taste of what is in the bigger seminar, and they tend to get more people to commit to the bigger seminar because they've seen a macrocosm of the macrocosm. They've seen a small piece of what the bigger one. Typically, the small piece is free of charge. So it's easier for people to see it. And when they see that presentation of the bigger one they need to pay for, they see the value for it, and it's easier for them to commit to it. And sometimes this is what we call pilot testing. You want to do a big project, instead of starting with a big project, you pilot test it, help people to see the value of it, and then it's easier for them to commit to a bigger one, but it's just getting into that human tendency to want to be consistent, and we talked about the third one, social proof, our wanting to be not to be different from others, right? It's in some cases what we call peer pressure, or peer pressure. You don't want to be, you don't want to stand out. You don't want to be the black swan, you don't want to, you don't want to be singled out, as it were, so because you want to do something and it's an easy decision if every other person in your social grouping, is doing it, so, and this involves, this is some of the, this is tapped into by reviews, product review, when you let the person making the decision know what people like him or her is already doing, it's easier to decide, in the direction of what people like him or her is already doing. Number four, we talk about authority, so easy to go in the direction or be influenced by someone we consider to be an authority in the direction of a decision we're trying to make. If it's a medical thing, I would rather follow, more easily listen to the decision of a professional, a doctor, a pastor, in the area of spirituality, you listen to people who are authorities in that wise, right? And liking also is, what is like it? Like, yeah. We tend to do things, uh, for people that we like, or things that we like, but I'm sure I'm not saying that very well. Wish, all right, that part of liking I am not getting right. It's not solid in my head, so I'm gonna come back to that. But we tend to do things for people that are like us, right? So it's that place where we can, if we can show that we like the things that the people like, and we're like those people that we're trying to get things, people love to associate or do things with those that they like, or that are like that are similar to them, and that's one of the things we say about selling. We say people don't buy products because of the product, but for the reason for the product. And that reason might just be that, this person that's handling or selling the product is like me, does things like me, has children like me, goes to the same church like me, and I see that in in timeshares, go for a timeshare seminar, they're going to pick someone that is similar to you in one form or the other. If you're a Christian, they're going to pair you with a Christian to make a presentation to you. If you go to a particular church or you work in a particular industry, they're going to pick someone that jives, that is similar, has similar belief, similar activities with you, So because if we tend to like someone, or someone, we see someone is like us, we tend to be more agreeable to them, So it's just a human tendency. Yeah, but there's another human tendency we call scarcity, and that comes from a place where we tend to things that we think are scarce seem to have high value for us. If we think something is not going to be, we're not going to, it's going to run out, it won't be available, the price suddenly goes up, and we tend to want to buy it because we have that fear of missing out, or lost opportunity, and that kind of persuades us in that direction. Uh, Lastly is unity, and unity is we tend to want to do things that are agreeable to the social grouping that we find ourselves, or we tend to do things that creates value for the social grouping that we belong to, you know. So it's that place where yeah. So it's if we show to people that will belong to a particular the same sector, the same race, ethnic grouping, or something similar to them, it's kind of similar to liking, but it's not liking. It's just that there's a kind of a unity of purpose, intent, and people tend to support things that they feel it belongs to their family. They have a family, clubs, fellowship, adherence, to it. Right. So those are the seven psychological principles we discussed as it relates to persuasion, Then and all of this was talking about on this chapter 4, talking about roping, pretty much convincing, our audience, as to the thing that we want to do. So the rope depends on multiple elements, not just the persuasive strategy, not just the negotiation that you use, or just the or not use and your identity and what we are, but how exactly we frame the proposition. How we frame the proposition goes a long way, to convince someone to go along with it or not go along with it, and that's what we'll talk about, the decision architecture, how we frame the presentation, So we can know all of these strategies, but how we frame the presentation goes a long way to convince someone to go along with it or not, right? So power power can come from the construction of the argument rather than its substance, right? It might have no substance in itself, but just the way it is constructed. And we'll see that, in statesmen when they talk, we've seen Hitler talk and the emotion he arouses in the people, respected statement, the way they talk. We looked at Antony when he came to bury Caesar, just the way he framed his discussion, knowing that his presentation, knowing that one, they did not like Caesar, and if his God went straight to praising Caesar, they will not listen to him. So first of all, to agree with their anger, agree with the state where the people were, and after they saw him in agreement with them, he could then take them to where he really wanted to go, which was to set them, against the people that killed Caesar. So the way you construct your presentation, can go a long way to help the people flow along with you and make a decision in agreement with you, right? So that's a powerful presentation by Antonio, that is used in that's used over the ages. It's and I read that also from Dale Carnegie. If you want to get someone to agree with you, you have first of all agree with them. Meet them where they are. When you meet them where they are, then they'll be able to listen to you, to follow you to where you want them to be or where you are, right? But the first point is to meet them where they are. So it's the construction of your presentation, carries the power of the presentation, and it goes a long way to sell what you're trying to convey. So a good confidence artist uses the structure of his speech to manipulate the way we perceive or think about something. The way it is presented, the pitch, the courage, the body language, all of that, can hypnotize. The key word is hypnotize, can hypnotize the listeners, right? In the hierarchy of communication, what a person sees, is higher than what a person hears. So not just what they're hearing, but the gesticulation, the body movement, the pitch, the pause, all of that go a long way to, unravel or hypnotize, the audience or the target. So how information is presented to us that can get to us to make decisions in a very precise way, and not necessarily in a way that corresponds to our stated preference. So how the information gets to us, it can go to affect the decision we make, if irrespective of our preference, right? So it's the way it is constructed, the way it is presented, can push us in one direction or the other, right? In many cases, our choices aren't based on some innate preference, right? It's not what our preference is. The presentation, the moment, the environment can go a long way to decide, to make us decide, one way or the other, which might be different from the decision we might make in another environment, without stimulation. Right. So we need to be wary of that, especially when it's a decision that is irreversible. We have to be wary of the props, the props that someone might be using to move us to make in the decision in one direction or the other. Because once we make that direction, it might be too late when we wake up from the hypnotism, right? So it's someone we need to be wary of, if we're the ones being presented to, and something we can use ourselves, but obviously it needs to be in an ethical way, if we're trying to help people to make decision in one direction or the other for a mutual beneficial outcome, right? So the psychology of why nudge obviously is a decision or influence decision. The psychology of why nudges decisions work forms the entire basis of confidence active soft power. Their soft power, is it's all in creating the right environment, the architecture around the environment where the victim is supposed to make the decision, right? For the timeshare, which is my big example, because I've been to several, it's one they created such that you have all that you need to make that decision in that place without having to leave and come back. Two, they have all the food, drink that you need to keep you entertained while you're there. They have things for your children to keep them engaged, and to wear you out, wear you out. So I guess some people make decisions just to escape that place, they wear you out, because they delay you for a start. You have the first one, you didn't close it, they pass you to another person, kind of wear you out. So you have to make up your mind, to on what you want to do, and not to uh try to make a that decision that will bind you in a bid to escape that place, rather let your no be cheap and your yes expensive. I love saying that. Let your no be cheap and let your yes be expensive. If you have not done your homework to know what you are going to end up binding yourself to, rather than say yes, say no. Right? Your no is redeemable. Your yes might not be redeemable. Right? So that's important. So the environment affects our choices. The environment where we're making that choice affects our choice. I remember years ago, going to buy a trouser for myself in one of the shops on the mainland, Yaba. You know, my mom used to do most of those purchases. This is one of the few I did growing up. I entered into that shop. They have special lighting. They don't have natural lighting inside those shops. Those special lightings make all the clothes there look new, different from how they will look if they're in the daylight, natural lighting. The lightings that, tweak the way your vision, the way you see those clothes, and it happened that I had bought the clothes based on the way it looked inside the shop with the blue lighting, only to get home or get into normal lighting. It didn't look as wonderful as it looked inside the shop, and that was when I learned that once they collect your money, they don't give your money back. Rather, the worst they can do, or the best they can do for you, is to have you pick another cloth to replace it. But the money you're giving to them doesn't come back. So that's an example of creating an atmosphere, an environment that influences your decision, in a lose-win position. You're losing, they're winning. They've tweaked the way what you're looking at, it appears to you that makes you make a decision that is suboptimal, right? So the environment affects our choices, yeah, right? No matter what the argument goes. So why not make sure it's doing so for the better? The environment affects our choices. So it's up to us to make sure that the environment that around which we're trying to make a decision helps us, not work against us. Obviously, the con actors will set it up in such a way that to work against us, that will make us think that we're getting our value that is not real, and we get entrapped by saying yes to the deal. So we need to be cognizant that what we're looking at it's just like we'll say, not all that glitters is gold. It looks like gold, but it's not gold. It could look like gold, because the environment has been tinkered with. So we need to be cognizant of the difference between that environment and what reality is. So what we're seeing in that moment might not be, what we'll see in the real moments thereafter, where we're supposed to leave the decision that we're making. And we have to be careful, especially when those decisions are not reversible. If it's reversible, yeah, we can just go ahead and think it back. But if it's not reversible, it might be something we're buying ourselves for life, So we need to be aware of that, and give the time to look at what we're looking at in the right environment, in the environment that simulates, reality, not a make-believe environment, so we don't make the wrong decision. Alrighty. So decision or choice architecture is the structural context design of how options and informations are presented to decision makers. So it's just the context, the environment, where those options and information are presented, where we get to make the decisions. I give an example of me going to buy trousers, pants, and the lighting inside the shop is tinkered with, such that everything looks new, looks special, looks shiny, but it's not the real view, right? So if you're going to make a decision in that kind of example, you pick the clothes and move outside the shop and look at it against natural light and see if you really like it. Yes, you like it in this tinkered lighting. Before you close the deal, go look at it in natural lighting and make sure you like what you see. Because what you see inside that shop is not what you're going to see when you step out of the shop, So so it can be tinkered, worked on in a way that works against us. It can also be tinkered in a way that works for us, because even in a natural setup, there could be things that work against us making the right decision. So in a setting where you're trying to help people make the right decision, you can help them set the environment against which they're making the decision in a way that would help them, optimize their decision. Just like a con artist would do it in the reverse, it can be done in the right way to help the person or the decision makers make an optimally beneficial, mutually optimally beneficial decision, right? That's the whole idea of decision architecture, right? It deals with how human beings actually form judgments, right? Make decisions and sustain meaning under conditions of uncertainty, right? So, I mean, if we're certain that we'll make the right decision, you're trying to make a decision for a life partner. If you can see the future, it's easy, but typically it's in a place of uncertainty. You don't know thereafter. You don't know if this person is deceiving me, or will we be compatible? We'll be able to make the decision. We'll be able to make the sacrifices, and sometimes you're trying to make decision between two things, so there's an opportunity cost in picking one as against the other, so you're wondering, what am I losing because of this decision that I'm making? Is it a value that's higher than the value I'm getting? So it helps, when we have things that help us, to be able to optimize, that decision and reduce the risk of making the wrong decision. And that's what the whole idea of decision architecture is. Again, it can be used in an ethical fashion. It can be used in an unethical fashion. In an ethical fashion, it's a win-win. In an unethical fashion, it's a win-lose or a lose-win, right? So by altering the choice environment, it guides individuals or teams towards optimal outcomes without restricting their freedom of choice. That's the ethical way to do it. In the unethical way of doing it, it guides the individual or team towards a suboptimal outcome, by restricting their freedom of choice. All right, there is restricting their freedom of choice. In the ethical fashion, you're doing it to help them make an optimal outcome, without restricting their freedom of choice. But there's the unethical part of it, whereby you are, in a sense, uh, trying to make them make a suboptimal outcome by restricting their freedom of choice, which could be uh it could be direct or indirect, right? The lighting is indirect. You think you're making you have freedom of choice, but the environment hasn't tinkered with. You are not seeing reality, right? And sometimes it could be that the choices are taken away. Some right choices are blinded off. Could be in the communication, but it's just the environment against which you're making that decision. It could be set in such a way that you make an optimal decision, you get an optimal outcome, or you make a suboptimal outcome, right? And just call and that's called decision architecture, right? The environment is such in such a way that it affects, the outcome of your decision or the um decision that you make, whether it's going to be optimal or suboptimal, right? So the concept, of decision architecture, acknowledges that humans are cognitive misses, right? We're limited in what we can see. There's more around you at any point in time than your brain is registering, right? We have we have what we call our conscious mind. Our conscious mind is limited in what it can register. Our subconscious mind can register everything that's taking place. Our subconscious mind is taking everything in, but it's not in our cognitive state, right? It's in our sub or unconscious cognitive state, right? So we're not able to process it directly, right? So in our conscious mind, what we see is limited. It's affected by factors, in our life, which could be habitual, our story, decisions that were made, our focus, our attention, that determines the things that we see. Right. So that's why I would say that what we see is a function of who we are. It's a function of who you are. What you see at each point in time is a function of who you are. Right. That's why you see what you're looking for. It doesn't mean that there are not more things there. Is that popular example that we give. If you say you want a red car, then you're going to see more red cars around. It doesn't mean that they just appear. They were there all the time, but you were not focused on it. You did not give your attention to it. So they were blinded off by the things that you were giving your attention to, right? So knowing the weaknesses, our weaknesses in this area, decision architects can help us, in making a decision, to make the things that will help our decision be optimal to come into our view, right? They set our environment in such a way that the more important or the key things that affect the optimality of our decision process are not blinded off. They are taken off our blind spot, right? So because of this weakness in us, if special attention is not taken to it, we'll tend to make a suboptimal decision, well, because we're limited, right? Our cognitive, our conscious mind is limited. Our subconscious mind is, in a sense, not limited, but it doesn't come to focus when we're making a conscious decision, because decision process is a conscious process. It's not a subconscious process. We're consciously making a decision, right? There are decisions that are made in the subconscious, at the subconscious level. Those are habitual, right? Habitual things. And decisions are made at a subconscious level. But when you're making a conscious decision, you're limited to your conscious mind. So we rely heavily on mental shortcuts and environmental cues rather than strict rational analysis, right? So when we're making decisions, who were affected by those seven psychological principles we mentioned here for persuasion. Our natural tendencies, are the things that affect us making decisions, where we're going to do things that in line with a trigger of our wanting to be to reciprocate, wanting to be consistent, wanting to favor our family or social setting, wanting to be like others, wanting to please the people that we like, will like, those natural things will affect our decision process. And sometimes, even though they are shortcuts, rule of thumb, they could be suboptimal because someone might be using that against us, right? So the our environment can be set to negate some of those influence, once we are aware of those shortcuts or shortfalls to our decision process. So therefore, modifying the context of a decision is often more effective than attempting to change human behavior through raw intention or force. All right. So we can modify the environment, uh, rather trying to change ourselves. It's a human nature, right? And it's going to take a lot to change us from being who we are, but we can change our environment more easily to address our shortfall, right? So nudging argues. Nudging is the same thing as decision architecture. Nudging or decision architecture argues that positive reinforcement and indirect suggestions can influence behavior and decision making. Right? If you reinforce something, it becomes more in the cognitive conscious mind realm, right? And that would then bring to bear, or that in a sense will cause your unconscious mind to place those things in your conscious view, right? Suggestions, are also, as it were, suggestions are like command to your subconscious mind to bring things to your conscious mind, right? So knowing that your conscious mind will only look at things that are relevant within the limit of what it can handle per time, because your conscious mind is limited, right? But if you can then reinforce the things that you believe will affect a particular decision, that aggregates that amongst the hierarchy of things, that it can handle, or things that it wants to handle at that point in time, right? So it says several factors in choice architecture can influence decision making, and this includes the number of choices presented. Uh, I've found, and I guess it's for everybody, that it's easier to make decisions when the options are few. When you give me too many options, it takes me forever to make a decision. Like I just went shopping for cutleries here, and I go on Amazon and I have so many options: black, gold, silver, different designs, and it becomes a bit difficult to close out on one, you know. So I had to bring in other factors in as to, oh, what do I have? What don't I have? Do I make a plain one, not plain one? Do I pick this color? Do I do gold, stainless steel, shiny stainless steel? Do I do black? But when you have too many options, it kind of dulls your first of all, your willingness to close on one, and the overload can also reduce the quality of the decision that you're going to make, right? So and that's problem here in today's age. We have so many to choose from, and no, that's the reason the quality of our decisions are probably not as good as they could be, because we just have so much to choose from, and we just pick the one that is, and sometimes we're lazy, and the time to make that decision is minimal, and we just jump at one, right? So yeah, so that affects the quality of our decision, the number of options that we're choosing from. You can imagine if someone has already pre-chosen and reduced that option, it increases, first of all, we're able to be more rational about our decision, and the quality of our decision is aggregated because some things have already been weeded out. Right. So, but the number of options affects the quality, and also our state also in making that decision. You feel tired if you have to make from a decision from a whole lot. All right, number two here is the manner in which the attributes are described, the way in which uh the different characteristics, attributes of each option is described can influence, our decisions. Something that is good could be described in a way that it makes it not presentable or attractive. The attribute, the person putting the attributes together might be focused on the part that is not the essential thing to you. Right. So you could describe an elephant and all they're talking about is the ears, right? That what the presentation of the attribute, it's a summary of the reality of what that thing is. And like the famous word is to say that the map is not a territory, right? No, the map is not a territory. The map is just a summary description of a territory. And it's only going to be as good as the person that put the map together and what that person is also focused on, right? So it might miss the mark in describing the territory, in a way that focuses on the things that are important to you, right? So the way the thing is described can affect your choice. And lastly, the presence of a default option, right? You have something and there's a backup option, or the similarities of the option, can affect the decision you make. If there's a big disparity, in the options, then it's easier to know this will work. But when they're closely related and the difference between them is not that much, the trade-offs are not that far apart, and that could easily sway you one way or the other. And there might be a big attribute that is not visible that you're missing by choosing one against the other, right? So the trade-offs can affect, the decision that you make. All right, I'm going to stop here for today. I'm about at the Ohio Mac. We'll continue next week. I hope I did well enough, on this topic. And most of what we've talked about has come from Rebecca here, talking about decision architecture, even though we've looked at all the other books also. Just talking about, how you build it surrounding around options that you want to decide from. All right. Thanks for coming along. God bless you. Enjoy your week and see you same time next Sunday, God willing. Bye bye. Shalom.